Welcome to the second of our launch seminars at the Centre for Global Higher Education. It's a great pleasure to see you all here. We look forward to a conversation equal in quality and interest to the one we had yesterday. When we worked on the design for the Centre for Global Higher Education, which was a year-long process which unfolded in 2014 and 15, issues of engagement, should I say concepts of engagement and impact were central to our thinking from the beginning. I guess that reflects the way that UK social science research is going, and also though it taps into a longer standing tradition in higher education studies as a field within social science. I mean, it's always been a field which is a site, a multidisciplinary site focused on practical problems of improvement in higher education system level, global level in fact also, and at institutional level. It's been developed out of a series of research projects in the policy space and designed to meet the needs of institutional managers and strategy. So it's had that kind of practivist orientation from the start. In fact, we've had to work quite hard to push it back to more fundamental issues of inquiry and to link it to core concepts and theorisations and methodologies in social science more broadly. And that's one of the things which we hope the Centre will advance. We also reflected on the character of the UK policy and practice space. And for myself, as someone who's only been in the UK for 2.5 years, I found myself comparing what I could see of the UK space with my own knowledge of the Australian policy and regulatory and practice space, and my knowledge of the United States, which is considerably more developed than my knowledge of the UK when I came here. And it seems to me that in many respects the UK policy and practice and regulatory space combines some virtues that neither of the others can really achieve. I mean, it's a matter of partly of scale. The American conversation, a lot happens at DuPont Circle in Washington, but the American conversation is fragmented because it's such a large country with many regional bases of importance. In Australia, there's not enough scale. The conversation is not broad and large and diverse enough to ensure that all the strands are continuously engaged. The national education organisations are good, but they're not as strong or as many as here. Here, you have I think the right scale. You have and you have the virtues of a sort of London-centric national conversation with the policy operators in particular centred here. That of course creates problems about the domination of the city, and also the fact that we don't successfully enfold the UK nations into what we do unless we work at it. And that's one of our tasks at CGHE, is to make sure our UK nation sensibility is adequate, because there are significant regulatory differences between the nations. But nonetheless, I think that the scale is very, and the coherence works very well, so that the policy and practice actors know each other, they talk to each other continually, and they push each other along. And the quality of policy-related seminars is very high here. But that, I think, also reflects the fact that of the calibre of many of the actors and the organisations, their sophistication, their grasp of the issues, their ability to talk about them in a convincing and persuasive way on behalf of the interests of their members in public. And this you can't, I suppose, create that kind of intellectual quality overnight. But it's one of the reasons why policy, and I include in that very much BIS and HEFCE and the regulatory agencies, the semi-government instrumentalities that are in and around, like HEA. These organisations are way ahead in many respects of theory. Practice and policy have advanced ahead of theory in the field of higher education studies, and perhaps ahead of data, although the data is probably stronger than the theoretical interpretations. And that's one of our tasks, I think, is to put a stronger intellectual reflexivity underneath those policy conversations which will inform them. What do we bring to the policy and practice space? What do we bring that would underpin all of our thinking about engagement and impact? Well, we bring the 3 research programs which are part of this rolling slide, and you can see the 3 programs listed also in the program guide which you picked up on the way in if you didn't read it yesterday. So we have our 6 projects under the heading Global, which are about world system and comparative studies, and are looking at UK higher ed partly from outside, which is very useful for the system. We have our projects which we call National, which are about the big national data collections, the big issues such as financing, equity and sustainability, loan system and so on. And we also have projects which we call local, and but with national and sometimes global resonances, and that's about the practice of HE institutions in areas such as their relations with each other, teaching and learning, the academic labour market, academic profession and its future, and the use of technologies and so on. So we have these 3 dimensions, and one of the things we offer, I think, to policymakers and to national education organisations is the possibility of connecting more effectively at a global level with like-minded policymakers and national organisations elsewhere, with research elsewhere, with the global higher education space. We think one of the things we have to offer is the potential to bring UK good practice further afield, and to also, for the UK, by engaging more effectively with countries around the world, to also learn and develop its own practices. So we think that we will help policymakers and institutional leaders in that respect. What we'll bring to that process is 5 or 6 full-time research associates, an apparatus of researchers which I think numbers about 25 and covers 3 UK partners and 8 international partners. Over time we'll develop more projects and more partners, and areas where we're not particularly strong at the moment, like South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, we may develop further work in more than we have now anyway. But we also took the opportunity when we put this program together to think about what impact means, and with the ref upon us constantly in the UK, that's a discussion which a lot of people are only too willing and able to have. One of the problems that's always seemed to me about the way we use impact administratively is that it's become a kind of property of the researchers rather than those that it's designed, the stakeholders of research, those that it's designed to assist. It's become something which we own and we develop and we define and we produce evidence about, when it probably should be more about pull from outside and about the capacity of stakeholders to affect and influence what we as researchers do. And I think it was that kind of idea of reciprocity and external determination that, that governed the way we decided to approach impact in the way we designed CG itself. From the beginning, particularly with the leadership of William Locke, we developed a list of associated organisations, those who signed up to become part of our activities. And most of the major national education organisations are on that list, but we've also gone a bit further afield than that. And we also recognise that we'd have a special relationship with BIS and HEFCE, although it may not be appropriate for the government department and the major regulator in our sector in England to sign up as an associate organisation. We would certainly be doing much of our work with reference to their needs and their interests and their ideas and their very capable research-related staff. So the idea of connecting instrumentally to the education organisations and the major regulators and government agencies in our sector was sort of integral from the beginning. We've designed our projects on the basis of shared governance, you might say, or shared involvement anyway, might be a better word. We have a project committee for each project. These are in the process of formation, but at a minimum they have 3 people: the project leader, someone else from one of our other research programs to encourage cross-program synergies, and a stakeholder representative. And some of those stakeholder representatives have already come in to projects. In some cases we'll have more than one stakeholder, and we'd expect that HEFCE and BIS will be involved in several projects, for example. Universities UK international units involved in 2, and so on. So we'll have multiple involvements. The involvement of stakeholders will be more than token. They'll be involved at every stage. We hope that they'll become part of the process of knowledge creation. We see them being involved in the original planning beyond the prospectus stage, which we reached at the stage of putting in a bid. The original planning of projects, Designing of impact indicators will be an important part of their role. They'll take part in the research in some cases, say when semi-structured interviews are involved, for example, in a project which is looking at student attitudes or student learning. We might bring in NUS as one of the parties to some of the interviews. We would certainly expect our stakeholders to be involved at the point of first cut of the data, first interpretation, and being critical friends in relation to our first drafts of papers. We would hope that our stakeholders become involved in the dissemination process when the research is taken out into the larger public space and into the particular organisations where it has the greatest contribution. In some cases that involves behind closed doors meetings with government officials or government or politicians before we release results. We would see jointly badged events as an important part of our public activities. The involvement of stakeholders in conferences, we would see some of them potentially as jointly badged as well. And of course, in dealing with the media, which is a constant and important part of our activity, we would really welcome cooperation with our stakeholder organisations. In relation to our own website too, we expect to be able to connect effectively to stakeholders. So we look forward to that. I think that impact and engagement is going to be one of our successes, but we'll work hard at it. It'll be continuous, and I think that that's got unknown potential and benefit in terms of the larger impact of our research program of social science and perhaps for UK higher education and the UK policy agencies offshore as well. And we look forward to that opportunity. And without further ado, I'd like to open up our program of speakers. We're going to begin with David Sweeney. Many of you will know David well. He's been a major thinker in the development of UK HE, and we look forward to what he will tell us about impact. Thanks, David.
Thanks very much, Simon. It's an immense pleasure to be here. This month marks my 25th anniversary in higher education. Previously, I worked in research, and many of the people in this room are the gods, actually, of higher education. I read your stuff, and I stand here before you really quite tentatively. I was asked to talk about the impact of learning and teaching. Of course, most of the last few years I've been spending on the impact of research, and I'm among people who know far, far more about education, about learning and teaching than I am. So I thought I'd talk about the lessons that there are from looking at the impact of research and contrasting that with the task that Simon has just been referring to. But, can I say, this is an exploration of the questions that we asked when we were developing research impact understanding. What were the frameworks that we developed to get from what I might call the test question to an answer? There, of course, being no single way, I think, of articulating the impact of research. It's not a discussion of how we apply the methods and techniques of research impact description to learning and teaching. I think that would be certainly the wrong place to start and probably the wrong place to get to. What are the questions we ask, though, in thinking about the impact of learning and teaching? And can I just say, this is not about assessment. You can't assess something until you can describe it in a satisfactory way. You understand the concepts. So although we're in a world where assessment is on our tongues all the time, and I've spent much time on the REF form of assessment, it's about understanding and describing, not that. So what was the test question on research? And is it the same question for learning and teaching? I think the question for research quite simply was, what difference does research make? What difference does particularly the public investment in research make to the world, the nation, the economy, society? Quite a simple but broad question. I think really since the initial thrust did come from the government, the question was, the comment was, we know you discover things, and you play very successfully in the reputation game that is around the quality of research in the global marketplace, but just tell us what difference that makes. That, I think, was what we worked on. So for teaching, what is the test question? Is it as simple as what difference does going to university make? And I think that's a starting point. We see different people asking this question very publicly all the time. In my experience with HEFCE, I've been working with business, with employers as part of my research job, but there's been a consistent theme from them on what they conceive of as the skills front. What's the benefit of hiring graduates? Students, of course, are asking questions given the commitment that they're taking on, both in terms of 3 years or whatever of study and the requirement to repay. And of course the government, which is paying the cost up front, wants to know about the benefit of going to university. All these people are asking the questions in perhaps different ways. Simon referred to looking at things, I think, from a beneficiary approach, which indeed is one of the lines we used on research impact, and which I've got to say got quite a pushback from some colleagues that beneficiaries was an inappropriate concept. But, well, that seems to me exactly the challenge. What is the test question? So I think the test question is essentially the same, but teasing out what the test question is an exercise in itself and a challenge from my talk. Is it legitimate, though, to ask that test question? Now, again, we got some considerable pushback when we were doing research impact. The proposition was that pursuing new knowledge or understanding was an intrinsic value in its own right, and asking a question like what difference does it make was perhaps not necessary. Now, like it or not, the question was asked, and in my view, not answering it led to a rather narrow definition of quality and excellence, and far better to face up to the question and understand it and develop, therefore, our thinking about what research is for in a broader context. One could say that it's difficult to justify 3 years of expensive university experience unless it does make a difference. And if you can't capture that difference in some way, then there's a problem. Is there an intrinsic value argument to fall back on? Not obvious to me that there is, but again, if there's a challenge of what the test question is, I think we've got to tease out whether we are just talking about some form of outcome, although, as I'll say, process comes into it. I almost got as far as saying for learning and teaching there is only impact. But of course there's process and environment as well. From the student point of view then, the question is what difference? For them there's a start point and an end point, and one could be as simple as say, can you demonstrate the difference? But students are not a tabula rasa. Prior attainment is a strictly limited measure when we conceive of higher education as, I suspect many of us do, as developing potential. There are conceptual approaches to look at developing potential, and I think if we are going to look at the difference between beginning and end, we've got to have a number of frameworks to look at it inside. For the government and the Competition and Markets Authority, it's a framework described around consumers and producers. Well, do we find that sufficient? That's probably a rhetorical question. But I suggest that nevertheless we do need to provide an answer within that framework, while perhaps arguing strongly that that framework is not sufficient and we need to articulate others. And again, Simon, it's terrible when the chair pinches your lines. Simon said this is not something that's just owned by academics. It's a cooperative activity, partnership involving the learner, other learner, teachers, and then, of course, the stakeholders I mentioned asking the question to begin with. So we've got, I think, to provide presumably richer descriptions of the difference, looking at capability, employment outcomes, which of course are not wholly the responsibility of the university, just as research impact is not wholly the responsibility of the researcher or the university. There are, I think, analogies, and I think we need to develop them. Just as there are perhaps more stakeholders asking the question about what the difference is in universities than we're asking the research question. I think it's a more complex question. There are more frameworks to look for in learning and teaching. In research, we looked at economic, social, cultural, environmental benefits, and actually there's about 10 more, which is in my standard slide pack. But the extensive work we did on developing the ideas for each of those domains actually came together. And we didn't end up with entirely different ways of looking or describing impact in those domains. I think one of the questions for learning and teaching is, because we need, in my view, to spread out and look broadly at many ways of capturing that difference, will indeed, if we do that, will we come back to a simpler way of describing it in the same way that we did with research. With research, we also had to look at basic research, translational research, applied research, less Frascati-oriented approaches around ideas and their impact. But again, there was still a very considerable confluence of ideas, so the methodology eventually we developed seemed to work quite well across different disciplines. Not clear to me whether, if we pose those same questions for learning and teaching, we'll find similarly it comes together. Now, 3 issues before I proceed. The first, which Simon's dealt with, who has responsibility for tackling the problem? Secondly, is it just about assessment, which I think I mentioned already? And third is, why are we where we are after many years of research? Well, who has the responsibility? There was some feeling that researchers at one time were perfectly capable of describing the impact of their work, and that indeed some suggested to me that only academics were so equipped to do it. Simon, I think, was suggesting that perhaps that capture has indeed happened. We thought that a collaborative exercise with beneficiaries provided more insight into impact issues, and indeed the process of developing the language was, I think, quite considerably informative. I do note, and delighted to see Simon rescued from Australia and Bruce over from Australia. In Australia, they tried to do the work exclusively described by beneficiaries. And there isn't time for me to explain why I thought that was a much less informed or satisfactory way of doing things. And to be fair, they were only piloting things there. I think in learning and teaching, we have to notice in education that many aspects of the subject have been sensitive. More so, actually, I think, than research, although, of course, there are areas of sensitivity as people's view of their own worth is perhaps, they feel, under attack from a description of impact. There is a straight conflict of interest if you're doing research about yourself. I do mean here research into the concepts of learning and teaching. The academics are personally conflicted because what they do on a day-by-day basis on teaching is under the microscope as it was for research. The universities are pretty conflicted because they've got different missions, and when you describe the way, when you capture that difference in a description, there's a real risk of putting status and hierarchy into the description in a way that makes it difficult to get universal agreement. There are issues of different views of what we're attempting to achieve in higher education, obviously, I would say, and issues of peer esteem. Now, all those issues were in some way live in the description of research impact, but I think not so acute as they are here, and I'll mention them later. And indeed, of course, the history of the discussion there's been on standards and on quality assurance could perhaps best be described as contested territory. And I was quite closely involved with what some people, I think, call quality wars, that might not be fair, of the 90s. Now, these issues of conflict of interest and the like may have hindered progress, but I think we've got to make a conscious attempt to rise above that. Gather our skirts and move on. We want, surely, a narrative that describes teaching and learning impact, education impact, that we are involved with, if not certainly doing it on our own. We certainly don't want it to be something that's done to us, rather than done by or with us and with partners. So we need a cooperative effort, as Simon said. Now, developments around research impact were driven by the need for assessment, and indeed the need for performance-based funding. But we got to all that after several years of developing the concepts and ideas. I'm talking today about the work we do to develop the concepts and ideas. Far better, I think, to do that than to get sidetracked by a whole load of very detailed issues about assessment. Why haven't we done all this before? Shed loads of work on educational development, graduateness, indeed quality assurance, people in the room who are real experts on that. But I think there's two things to say. I think we've failed to capture what we understand in a language that goes outside the academy. And the test question is coming from outside the academy. So I think there's an enormous base of work on which we can build and synthesize, but we also have to summarize. Secondly, there are so many areas of contention in this that we've failed to reach any kind of overarching framework. It's just incredibly sensitive, some of the stuff we're talking about, because it's about the lives of students and their futures, as well as, of course, being, as I've already said, about academics. Perhaps it's all too difficult. And one of your eminent colleagues suggested to me, actually in December, I think, that it really just was all too difficult. Now, well, so it may be, but surely the pursuit of knowledge and understanding is just simply not about saying things are too difficult. And nor, I believe, will the world, the people who are asking those questions, accept that we are in some way so different that we can't capture what we do. And those same things, I think, were raised in the early days when we were looking at research impact. Too difficult, can't be done. Well, we did it. And although you can analyze what we did, and we have done, and others have done, and there are ways of improving what we've done, we, I think, captured stuff that withstood the test of quite a big exercise. I think on learning and teaching, perhaps it was okay not to look at these things when a small minority of people went to university, largely funded by those who didn't go to university. But now that it's a mass market activity, that there's a high expectation, and that universities are a much more central part of society in every sense that they were when I started in 1991, I think we can't just say it's all too difficult. So, moving to some thoughts on where we go. Let me just talk for a moment about the issue with research. Some kinds of research came with a particular cachet, which depended essentially on peer esteem. Academics have collective views about the importance of basic research, not all holding the same view, but I think quite strong views about what is the most important, best research to do. We felt that trying to categorize basic research as more important than applied research, for example, was just inappropriate. Value judgments were inappropriate. We wanted to give equal status to people engaging in all different kinds of research. And since eventually we had to do some kind of assessment mechanism, that was important. And indeed, there was a very considerable cry from within the academy for peer esteem, for the full range of things that academics did. We wanted to legitimize the application of superlatives to different kinds of research. Now, I think there's an analogous question for learning and teaching, which comes down to how much do we truly value diversity and how much do we place a priority on certain kinds of higher education. I think we should legitimize actually everything that comes under our current higher education banner, and we should look for ways of describing it constructively and with the same peer esteem. I'm trying, though, to avoid getting into the use of terms like quality and excellence, which I think immediately make it difficult at the start to crystallize your definitions of difference. The difference that we expect from a university experience clearly often involves an intellectual development, which is articulated in many ways and difficult to capture. There are skills acquisitions, with not everybody seeing peer esteem for professional skills such as medicine and law and other very specific job-orientated skills. Now, is that right? Should we in the academy be applying that value judgment? And then, of course, there's the tricky issue of so-called transferable skills, often not recognized as part of the academic experience, but nevertheless gained at university. Also, of course, social skills, social capital. I think we've got, in facing this challenge of articulating the difference, to decide where we stand on hierarchies and values, and you'll see where I stand. I think we certainly want to work on the difference that is distinctively delivered by the higher education experience. We are doing something different to other people, but I wonder if the lack of mutual esteem from practitioners in one area as opposed to the other, and associated, and I dare to say here, somewhat irrational hierarchies, may be a block to us actually describing that difference. I think if employers are always going to conceive of their question in the way of transferable skills, and many do, then I think it's better to embrace it and answer it and work out how we do that within the framework of higher education, rather than partitioning off as something that is not distinctive. So there's the hierarchy in different kinds of our objectives for higher education. With research impact, we asked whether it was necessary to look through a disciplinary lens, concluded that we did, although some now consider we should revisit that conclusion. We spent a lot of time and wrote a lot of words describing every conceivable kind of research impact on a disciplinary basis. Enormous amount of material. And as I said, we found much commonality, which helped in the development of a framework. So is there, same question, is there a disciplinary locus for L&T? Captured, I guess, in the Green Paper question about that. We've, of course, long had subject benchmark statements, which look at things on a disciplinary basis, developed as part of the QA process, but perhaps not always fully owned by the academic community. Of course, our articulation has got to be done, academic community with the public. Do we need to do it on a disciplinary basis? I would propose to you that as we had to do it with research and now decide whether it's necessary, we have to do it for teaching. It's most difficult, I think, for those courses which privilege intellectual development over practical outcomes. It's, at first glance, particularly difficult to do, but then, as I said, we're not going to step away from the difficult challenges. The Green Paper, the government's Green Paper, talks a lot about using proxy metrics. I think it's very difficult. I think Paul wrote something about this. It's quite difficult to go too far in proxy metrics until you've got your concepts sorted out. The HEFCE annual lecture, Andreas Schleicher from OECD talked about essentially assessing the value of higher education by looking at transferable skills acquisition as a framework. I think you said something about that, Paul, as well, that suggested that wasn't the best way to do it. Well, I think we have to have that discussion more broadly. I think we do have to look at transferable skills. Certainly, for me, it's not the proxy that solves the problem or anything near it. And of course, we've got examples of begin and end activity that are fairly straightforward. The GMC looking at giving essentially an exit exam to doctors so that they get their certificate to practice rather than getting it at the end of their first postgraduate year at the moment. So there's different ways of looking at these things. Are we going to build a framework that embraces those, or is it too difficult? I think I've demonstrated that it's pretty complex, but perhaps you knew that. Research impact seemed complex, and in the early days, eminent sometimes academics, even maybe Nobel Prize winners, would sidle up to me and they'd utter one sentence and they say, "So I proved that research impact won't work." things like you can't predict the impact of research was put to me as a killer argument. Well, in fact, there were ways around that. We didn't try and predict the impact of research. Most of the killer questions proved to be a very narrow view of a particular problem. And when clever people, and we involved thousands of people in developing the concepts around research impact, and we don't own this, we just helped it along, most of those killer arguments disappeared. So I'm not very keen on people coming and telling me you can't look, you can't conceptualize teaching and learning impact just because of a single issue. So I don't like the argument it's too complicated and too difficult. I don't like the argument that you can't do it because of some simple conclusion. I'm coming to the view you've got to do it. And I think, just as an example, people will say, well, you can't possibly measure the difference for an individual from the start of course to the end of course without, complex beginning and after exams, and that's indeed sounds incredibly complex. But I think, for example, there's cohort measures you can use that would get you quite a long way in your understanding of what's happened. And I think, again, it's a mistake to look for ways of measuring things until you've found ways of articulating what you're trying to measure. The process, of course, of learning and teaching is important. Our quality assurance, because it's so difficult to assess outcomes, talks about what you do. And I think that too has to come in to the framework. We've got to characterize, I think, the benefit as a collaborative experience. It's not, students are not a consumer. The effort they put in really matters. And we've got to find some way of capturing that. And of course, we're seeing a lot of work going on that. We're doing learning gain stuff. There's been student engagement stuff published already. I think we're learning a lot at the moment, and there's a lot to feed in to our process. So I think we should look at things by discipline, we should look at things broadly, we should start with a very high-level framework and be prepared to invest time to do it. What I don't have, because there isn't quite the driver that there was on research, is a mechanism to do it, which is why I'm here. Not that I suggest that the Centre for Global Higher Education should do this as part of the funding we do, but for them to propose ways in which it might be done. Only we, I think, will stimulate this. Or we will end up with instrumental ways of doing it driven by people who don't, I think, fully understand what we're trying to do. Only we, I think, in partnership with others, can truly justify the confidence and investment which the nation has placed in our universities. We means you. I think these issues are extremely difficult. They're challenging personally, and I think we owe it the responsibility that the nation has placed on us in the privileged position of being academics to take this question forward, to take responsibility for it within the academy, supported by people like us, and to attempt to capture the difference that university makes, to have a framework for explaining the impact of higher education, of learning and teaching, which I am sure, as with research impact, demonstrating that the investment delivered magnificently for the nation and the world, that university education does that for the individual and for the country. Thanks very much.
Well, that's quite a challenge, and we at the Centre for Global Higher Education, I think, to an extent, will be informed by the thinking of our next two speakers in relation to that challenge. It's a pleasure to introduce Elise Oancea. When we were preparing the submission for funding for the Centre, we were delighted to come across her published work on impact, and we found that really the most significant research-based attempt to get to grips with this major transformative regulatory tool. And of course, if we have impact working as it has been since if we have impact working as it has been in research in the last research assessment exercise, then you imagine what impact will do if it's operationalised in a systematic and effective way in relation to learning and teaching. So these are major important issues and transformative not only for the HE sector in the UK, but for the world, higher education world as a whole, because what happens in this country, for better or worse, does tend to have a substantial influence on the waves of reform that then run their way through other systems. So without any further delay, Elise, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm delighted to be here. I'll try to draw on some of the research that I've been doing over the past decade or so in order to make 4 points. One, to note the rise of impact, linking it to what David was saying earlier. Second, to talk about narratives of impact and the narrative construction of notions of research impact. Third, to make a few comments on how impact arises from relational spaces, from networks of complex interactions. And finally, to suggest something which I think is a slightly more textured conceptual model of research impact, so an exploration of the conceptual geography of research impact. So, I think it's not very controversial to say that we are reaching a point of a kind of grudging consensus around impact being part of common discourse amongst higher education researchers and beneficiaries, to use the term, and also about impact being part of accountability systems for higher education. And this consensus draws on long-term trends in policy and more widely internationally in higher education, in the higher education sector. And some of these trends are policy-driven, such as the notion of wealth creation and public accountability. Others are more global, more international in scope, such as the discourses around knowledge and innovation and the knowledge economy and so forth. Others are more professionally driven, such as the drive towards evidence-based practice, in particular professions, or towards evidence-informed policy. But while all of those things were happening, what was also happening in the background, I feel, was a renegotiation of the relationships between, over long term, of the relationships between universities and the state. And outcomes of that process of renegotiation include performance-based funding of research, concentration of research funding, the inclusion of impact amongst accountability measures and accountability processes for research, all of which have become conditional of professional autonomy and self-regulation in higher education. What I find quite interesting, looking back at the last maybe decade or 2 decades or so of work in this field, is that whilst this renegotiation was happening, we often get distracted, diverted into debates around the technical aspects of how to do the different things, which metrics are appropriate, how to construct an accurate indicator, and so forth, rather than returning to the more fundamental debates around the principles underpinning those relationships. And I'll just illustrate this, just for the fun of it really, with 2 quotes from the ref. In 2001 and 2008, this was the definition of research that we operated with. So research, original investigation in order to gain knowledge and understanding. And that, by the latest installment of the exercise, had shifted slightly into new insights effectively shared. So the point that I'm making is that impact has not only been one thing, yet another thing to be added to a panoply of a variety, of a range of possible aspects of research to look at, but it's actually cutting to the heart of how research is defined, to the nature of what the research, how the research enterprise is constructed in the public space at the moment. So what were the responses to this, what I would say was a quite dramatic change in how we see research? Well, the responses have been multiple and wide-ranging, amounting to what I would suggest was an organizational recalibration of higher education institutions towards impact performance. So we have seen changes in structures and infrastructures for research. We have seen changes in roles within higher education institutions. I'd be quite surprised I'll stick my neck out on this one, to find a higher education institution where there isn't a person that's got the role of impact officer or knowledge exchange officer or project officer these days. The structure of academic careers and progression patterns have changed as well, and you can see impact seeping into recruitment criteria and promotion criteria and so forth. There's the parallel explosion of tools and services meant to support institutions in capturing information, storing it and organizing it for reporting on impact, some of which is for profit, some of which is based in universities themselves. Tools and metrics have proliferated. There's a kind of swell still of a big movement in that direction. Another thing I have, and I'm going to pause here for a second, I find interesting is that in parallel to all of these developments, we've also seen shifts in how research evaluation itself is structured, organized, and stratified. Don't worry about reading the stuff on there. The point of this is that research evaluation itself has become stratified. You have the sub-organizational level, the organizational level, and the supra-organizational level. And the purposes of evaluating, of assessing research, the rationale, the governance, the strategies, the procedures, the metrics being used vary from one level to another. And very interestingly, what also varies is the balance of expertise that is required in order to perform well and also to perform the evaluation well. So if you, at this level, which is evaluating teams and individuals and projects and outputs and outcomes, you still need quite a lot of substantive expertise and experience in the field that you are assessing in order for the assessment to function close to the traditional peer review. But the further you go towards the kind of national, international, large research systems level, the more procedural expertise you need in performing that, which is expertise in the criteria, the guidelines, how the assessment itself works, and so forth. And you can see in universities lots of positions being advertised that try to balance between the two forms of expertise, and it's a very tricky balance to achieve. So, that was on the rise of impact. Moving on to narratives of impact. There's a number of metaphors that kind of abound in the public space around research impact, and I'm just going to pick a few for you. One is the puzzle-solving metaphor, where you have a problem with finite aspects, and research can help put things in order and provide a solution to it. And then there's a tome of evidence metaphor. If you accumulate enough evidence, it will be weighty enough to shift decisions and to shift opinion. You have the putting things in balance, where research might counterbalance common sense or political commitments and other things. You have the listening metaphor, where research enables practitioners and policy makers and other partners to articulate in different ways some of the things that are specific to their practice. You have the toolbox metaphor, where research produces neutral tools to be picked and mixed and used as appropriate in different practical contexts. Then there's the well-known elevator pitch, which kind of points to the difference in pace between the different settings in which research might function. You have the two cultures, where practice and policy and research have different languages and different cultures, and impact is the thing that enables us to bridge across the two. You have shouting, or speaking truth to power. You have the drop in the ocean, or the drop that makes the glass overflow. You have conjuring magic tricks, howling to the moon. And this is one of my favorites because it links to the writings of Carol Weiss on research utilization. And it's about knowledge creep. It's about the subtle ways in which research might move into the public sphere, shift discourses, shift language, shift the ways in which we see things, change the face of things in ways that perhaps become no longer attributable back to an individual piece of research. And I'll return to this point near the end. Now, in 2010, right after the pilot exercise for the REF impact element, but before the guidance was produced, I went around different disciplines and interviewed researchers as well as users or partners or beneficiaries about how they conceived of the impact of research and what were the issues that they identified. So I'll just highlight a couple of, or three actually, narratives that are arising from that work. In the arts and the humanities, some of the things that were highlighted to me were the very strong links to disciplines and to traditions of inquiry, but also the fact that there were a number of things in those fields that could work as anchors for any exploration of what impact might mean in those fields. Things that were already part of the practices associated with these fields. Cultural value, outreach, educational value, public engagement, and so forth were quite common language in the fields already. But people also pointed out to me that impact and knowledge generation in those fields is a collective process. It's something that comes from the collective efforts of academics and people from other contexts over an extended period of time. And also they pointed out to me that driving a line between, in the arts for example, between creative practice and change, impact, somehow outside the boundaries of that creative practice in higher education was something that didn't make entirely sense for those practitioners. So here at the bottom you see some quotes from some of my interviewees. One pointing out how hard it may be to demonstrate impact that arises from multiple relationships and multiple types of interactions without actually delving into those interactions and trying to work out what they look like. And the other talking about the impact of a whole field, the impact of those collective processes. In the social sciences, the disciplines weren't mentioned as much, but people talked about different types and modes of research, and again about a number of anchors: policy, working with policymakers, transferring methods, influence, visibility, and so forth. User engagement and the co-construction of knowledge with partners from within and from without academia, again, were very comfortable concepts for the people I interviewed. So in their case, what they said is that, forget the new buzzword. It's not about kind of grafting a new language, even an artificial language, onto our practices, but it's about expressing, articulating our practices, perhaps in clearer and better ways. And a final example from the theoretical sciences, where there was a lot of talk about contribution to the kind of wider stock of disciplinary knowledge. But there was also a worry about falling between two extremes, the attraction of science for science's sake and commercialization. And there was a lot of worry at that stage about being pushed into kind of the sideways from into maybe methodological transfer or areas of impact that reduce, narrow the horizon of benefits. So that was the language in 2010, before we went through the impact exercise. I also did a study more recently, 2014-15, in which we analyzed line by line the entire impact submission of a research-intensive university. Hard to guess, I guess, which university that was. And we looked at all of the case studies, 270 case studies, and all of the impact templates that were submitted to all of the units of assessment. And these are word clouds based on the full text of those submissions by disciplinary grouping. So one of these will be medical sciences, quite hard to guess, I guess, which one. One of them will be engineering and life sciences. Another one would be social sciences, and another one would be arts and humanities. The language is slightly different, and I want to delve a bit deeper into this statement. So this is the abstract of a case study that was submitted to the ref. And if we look for keywords in here, this is in the medical sciences. So if we look for keywords in here, you get successfully demonstrated, you get saving hundreds of lives, and 225 million people every year. Pretty impressive stuff. And what I find interesting in this is that it's got a particular pattern of construction of this text as a narrative. You get some background to begin with on the research in green, and then in orange you get the kind of meat of that, and then in red at the bottom you get a big claim. Quite hard to argue with that once you've reached that claim. So this is what I will call this a climactic construction of this particular case study. Look at another one. Climate science this time. Keywords again. It's novel, it's got that many people, but this is how they did it, citizen science, this is what it led to, and then there's another 3,000 people, and it's also done this particular thing. The structure is different. It's kind of the other way around. You start with that big claim and with the big numbers, and then you get the meat of it, the explanation, and then at the end in green you get extra, kind of extension, additional impact. That's the headline type of narrative construction of the case studies. This one's from my own unit of assessment. It's quite complicated to work it out now. You get the research, you get some contributions that it's made, you get a big impact claim right there in the middle, and then you get a list of things, of different contributions, different ways in which it has made a difference. And it is indeed a pretty mixed picture. You have the big impact claim in the middle, and then you have the list of things. They could be interspaced, but this is an example, key example type of narrative. You could have, we have this impact, and this is how we did it, and another impact, and this is how, and we can find quite a few case studies that were structured like this. So climactic, headline, key examples, and this is the last one I'm going to show you. You find numbers now in there which aren't about how far the research reached, but are dates. So the structure of this starts with the research and then moves through different phases of use and of engagement with the outside world to lead to some final claims. This is a chronological structure. Now, interestingly, looking at all of those case studies, they all fall into those patterns. So you get some of them which are climactic, some of them which are headlines, some of them which are key examples, and some of them which are chronological. And I will go into details about which one seems to have been associated with higher results, with higher rankings in the ref. But then within each of those different types, you get different types of plots. For example, you get a demand-led one, where you start by presenting demand and then move to an impact claim, move to reach, move to secondary impact. Or you get the development one, which is more about technology, spin-outs and so forth. So you can find those patterns in how we have tried to answer the test question in the last Research Excellence Framework. And in support of that, we used all sorts of different kinds of evidence, and it's interesting that testimonials really by far lead the way, because these are the kinds of evidence that seem to produce the context from the partner organizations that was required in order to understand and interpret all of the things that were included in the case studies. So a rather different vocabulary, if you cast your mind back to what people were saying they valued about their research before the ref, to what things look like now. And that vocabulary falls in line, I think, with something that's been growing over the past, several decades, again at different levels. You have different indicators, you have different metrics. Some of them are minute things, such as the number of grant applications and so forth. Others are slightly larger popularity indicators. There are macro things, such as the significance and reach of a piece of research. But what I want to draw your attention to is this meta level of metrics and of language, which is an artifact of research assessment itself, not just of the ref, but of a number of other things. These are the examples from the ref and the research assessment exercises. So at individual level, you get things like the refability of an individual, or the impactfulness of their work, or the 3 and 4 starness of their publications, or the 4x4ness, this is a new one for me, of an individual. Some people laugh, so you know what all of this is about. And then at the higher education unit level, at the school level, you get all sorts of constructions that were produced after the exercise itself. Research intensity, research power, point scores, ways of playing with the figures. And at the field level, you get this talk about the relative fourness of different fields, regardless of any kind of caveats placed in the exercise itself around the use of such language. So, to make a case for the ref, this person says, one of my interviewees, we measured, we counted, we itemized, we did all of those things, and then they added, but you have to be careful not to become prisoners of those metrics that we construct for ourselves. And that's an argument that's been made in lots of literature since and before the ref. And I picked those books partly for the superficial reason that the covers, the titles are similar and the covers look the same. You get a bit of kind of urban grit for the social sciences and a bit of kind of poise for the humanities. This one makes an argument about the unquantifiability of essentially human dimensions of life, such as history, beauty, imagination, truth. The other book does a similar thing and argues about trust, altruism, tolerance, compromise, improvement, and so forth. I interviewed with colleagues last year up and down the country in all of the disciplines associated with the arts and the humanities. And this is a summary of the things that people said are valuable about research in those fields. And if you look at the vocabulary that they use, it's a vocabulary of enrichment and transformation, and the contribution of research to personal growth, being human, making sense of human experience, release, coping, healing, exhilaration, and so forth. They talked about connectedness and rootedness, about social cohesion, about recovering marginalized identities, about understanding and empathy. They made points about engagement and criticality, about aesthetic experiences, about voice, resistance, making silenced identities vocal, motivating, and understand the dialogue and understanding difference. Now, if we pause on this kind of language and think back to the language of the case studies, I think there is a striking difference there, and I will return to this difference in a moment. So, impact, narratives, networks. Another study that I've been involved in tried to kind of track the relational space through which impact arises. And I'll show you some pretty pictures that are based on a qualitative network analysis. This is an illustration of the network surrounding a project in a very conventional project, what we might call fundamental science, basic science in the theoretical sciences. And you have a small research team in the middle, and then around it you have collaborators, competitors here in gray, and somewhere on the margin, users or beneficiaries or potential beneficiaries, these ones in blue. So quite removed from the center of that project. And that is not something to panic about. That is the way in which things may work in that particular field, with a very long and complex horizon of benefit. And then have a look at this one, which is from the humanities. It looks different. It's from classics, but it's not. It's still a very conventional structure. The only difference is that it's based into higher education institutions, which is why it looks so complicated, and the team in the middle is a bit larger. But the actual potential users or beneficiaries that were identified were still quite far on the margin, because, again, this was the way of working in that particular project. These are all project-based. This one's different, though. This is from geography, from the social sciences. It is a project which was based on co-construction and co-design of research from day one. So at the center of the project here, you have users. You have them all the way through the different layers of that particular network. And that is a very viable way of generating impact as well. And then this one is completely the other way around. It should all be blue. It should all be about partners and users and beneficiaries from outside the higher education sector, because the higher education researchers were brought into a community-based organization which led the entire research and engagement process. And then you get this one, which is when my researcher was, the board was taken out of her hands, and the people from the art and design organization in being interviewed said, well, let me draw for you, forget about your bubbles and circles, let me draw for you what we think the relationships between us and our partners look like. So they drew this treble helix. So, let me pause for a second and remind you. Impact is constructed narratively. We use different kinds of languages which have been influenced by the recent assessment exercise. And impact arises from a relational space. How well do we capture all of those things in our accounts of impact is the question. In his book, which I really like, The Concept of Mind, Gilbert Ryle tells a little story. Imagine somebody coming to Oxford who has never been there before, and I can use the example because that's my home. they get shown the museums, the buildings, the sports grounds, the colleges, the faculties, and so forth, and they walk all around. And at the end they ask, okay, so where's the university? And Ryle says, well, in asking that question, the person is not wielding the concept of university in this context properly. They are making a category mistake. They are allocating the concept of university to the same logical category as museum and faculty building and so forth. But once you've seen all of those things in Oxford, you've seen the university. It belongs to a different logical category. So if you look at what we've reported in the ref, you see dissemination, you see public engagement, you see use, you see exploitation, commercialization, you see making a difference in all sorts of different ways. Somebody who's not familiar with this could be well forgiven for asking, okay, so where's the impact? And the problem I see with that is that we're making a category mistake. We're allocating the concept of impact to the same category as dissemination and use and exploitation and so forth. And this is what I try to do with this particular way of trying to think about impact. I put all of those things together, and I suggest that it's actually something which is relational and very textured, very layered. So you do have this connectedness, so you have the co-construction, you have the partnerships that are at the heart of the research project itself, but you also have visibility, pushing research out into the public domain through to different audiences and promoters, so that the relational language changes here. You also have application in use and different users and mediators. You also have individual, community, and societal benefits. And around that, you have something that, for lack of a better word, really, something like diffusion. It's that thing, going back to the knowledge creep metaphor, it's that thing which is about changing public discourses, shifting the ways in which problems are framed in the public space and in which solutions are articulated. Now, what's interesting about this is that the further away you go from the center of this diagram, the wider the scope of the overall potential impact is. But also the further away you go, the harder it is then to make any kind of meaningful attribution to an individual piece of research or to an individual researcher. Now, the problem with the past exercise and with any kind of assessment of impact is that we tend to collect data about what we can measure, so kind of these first maybe 3 circles, in order to make a case about what we need to make a case on, which are these 2 circles, application and use and societal benefits. But in doing that, often we end up not saying very much about the things that we really care about wider shifts, about the cultural frames, about the deep benefits. Because they're hard to articulate, and because they are perceived as risks when it comes to an assessment system that has financial incentives associated with this reward system. So I think we need to think long and hard about whether this is the discursive space that we want to inhabit, and about the ways forward for research impact, which would involve things like technically refined measures and thinking about indicators, but in a way that draws on a healthy ecology of higher education that has intellectual autonomy, that has financial sustainability, and has insightful governance. Otherwise, my worry would be that high-stakes assessment only ends up capturing assessment-driven hyperactivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elise, for opening up the whole question of impact in a much more fine-grained and textured and relational way for us. And I think that framework gives us an opportunity to move and develop further. I mean, I think we all agree with your conclusion, but finding the way there is not so easy. If we have measurement of learning and teaching impact, we'll have another set of issues again, quite a different kind of construction and relational space. And where the two would relate to each other is another question. What we'll do now, I think, is take some question and answer and discussion. Probably run that for about 15 minutes or so. This is your, I think, first opportunity to come in and comment and of course, particularly in relation to Elise, ask. about the two presentations, and then we'll move to Paul Ashwin's final major paper. So can I call for hands, those who would come in at this point? Particularly like to talk to Elise. Yes, Peter.
Peter Scott. I always think one of the problems with impact is however strongly we try and resist it, it forces us to adopt a rather linear and rather naive view of how innovation takes place, in which very conveniently we are the privileged people. We start and we have these great ideas and then they get disseminated and applied in various ways. Actually, most of the real models of innovation show it doesn't really work like that. It's a much more kind of multi-dimensional kind of thing. So sometimes the creative actors aren't necessarily us. I mean, we're in a sense the servants of the process. And the problem with impact, I mean, it's fine for David Sweeney. You have to make a system which works, so we have to write it up in a various ways, so we can all get very good at doing that. But we shouldn't fall for it and feel that's actually a really accurate and truthful account of how impact takes place. And maybe one of the things we need to do is, without jettisoning in any way the importance of impact and social usefulness and all those things, to find more kind of nuanced and more sophisticated ideas of how impact actually works in the research domain.
More thoughts? Yes. I think you're first, and then. Yeah.
I'm guessing David may have escaped already, but I'd be interested to know Alex and other people's views on the potential of a metrics-only approach to TEF and to REF.
I think that's a question, Elise. We might pass it back to you if that's possible.
I think I'll comment mostly on the research side of things, given what I've just said. There is a danger there, I think, of being diverted again into a very technical debate. I am fully aware, and the people I've interviewed have made that very clear, that we all suffer of REF fatigue, and that developing the case studies has been extremely laborious, and perhaps the sense of the rewards that was built into the exercise for that hard work is not fully there. However, I think there is a great risk in responding to that fatigue simply by changing something for the sake of changing it. We need to think very hard about what the implications of that is. In relation to what was said earlier, the fact that we can, however difficult it might be, we can measure something doesn't it necessarily entail that we ought to measure that thing in this particularly quantifiable way. There are very good uses for quantitative evidence in talking about impact, but all of those different things capture only certain facets, and I don't think we can get away from the need to contextualize and to get those richer and more nuanced narratives on the table.
Diana? Ian?
Thank you. It's a really interesting talk, Elise. Thank you very much. And it was an opportunity to reflect on what David had been talking earlier about in relation to teaching impact. And his talk has made me wonder about the extent to which you can use that research impact. Sorry.
Okay, is that better? Oh, yes, that's a lot better. Okay. To what extent can you use research impact as a reasonable analogy for thinking about teaching impact? In the context of research, we're doing something really very different. We're trying to find out about the world. In the context of teaching, we're trying to move minds. And those are rather different kinds of social and research and development activity. And your final slide put, for example, beneficiaries, individuals, society, and so on the outer periphery of that process. In teaching, the beneficiaries are right at the center of it. And we hope that there will, of course, also be impact out to society, and that we expect that to be proximal rather than distal. So shouldn't we really be rethinking, reconceptualizing? And if we go back, as indeed David said, think through what the concepts are first, but how long is that going to take? shouldn't we be involving the stakeholders in this whole process, including the students and graduates and alumni and employers and so on? Shouldn't we be approaching the teaching impact process in a rather different way from the research impact process? Everything you've said about research impact suggests to me it's a very different kind of exercise, and we should be tackling this in a different way from that process.
I think as an educationalist, I'm inclined to be very much in agreement with you. Going back to the diagram, I am aware of the fact that it can be read as center and periphery. The way I read it is, it's mostly a measure of my ability to visualize. The way I read it is, the fullness of things and the beginnings, the kind of emerging stages of things. I very much agree with what you say about the fact that the analogy between the search for knowledge and the relationships between the search for knowledge and other parts of society is different in nature from the educative relationship, which is at the heart of any kind of measures of teaching and learning, and that we need to think as educationalists when we reflect on anything related to a forthcoming HEF. I can't really go further much beyond that because I haven't done the research.
And we don't have the framework either. Indeed. And that, of course, is going to change everything. Now, I've got Ian and John, but also I'm going to bring William in at this point.
Yeah, can I? Because I agree that measuring the impact of teaching and research are very different things. But I was listening quite carefully to David, and I kind of listened to the things that he didn't say as much as the things he did say. But I did also get a strong sense that in measuring the impact of research, we're talking about often talking about wider impacts or influences. And we should actually be thinking of that in terms of teaching as well. We have kind of individualized this whole process. It's about individual students and graduates in terms of teaching, but it's not just about individual students and graduates and their benefits and gains. It's about all the wider benefits, which we were talking about yesterday as well. So that was one thing. And also, David did imply that it had taken quite a long time to think about research and what the impact of research means, maybe several years for HEFCE in discussion with people in the sector and outside the sector. And we shouldn't be trying to rush the same kind of process with regard to teaching. So actually, I took a couple of key things from what he was talking about in terms of measuring the impact of research that could then be applied to thinking about measuring the impact of teaching and learning.
Colleagues, I've got Ian and John coming now. We're going to close this short Q&A fairly soon, so if you want to speak, put your hand in the air soon. Ian. Ian is here.
Ian McNay, University of Greenwich. A theme is emerging. Part of my preparing case studies in education and education management was the exclusion of the impact on teaching from any impact, when most of the impact I think I've had has been through teaching. David Sweeney, 2 years ago when he came to Greenwich, claimed that I'd changed the course of his career. I'm not sure how much that would count in a case of impact, whether it be for good or evil. But nevertheless, I want to reinforce that link between teaching and research, in that much of my teaching derives from a research base with my students who bring problems which inform the work and develop the research theory tested against their experience in practice and vice versa. I like your word diffusion. I'd written it down before your slide came up because I think there's a vagueness or a lack of boundary, if you like, to the impact that I have. I don't know about much of it because people don't come back and tell me, but I become aware of it informally. And I think the other thing I learned from you, Alice, and thank you very much, was the mistake I made in preparing the case study. I didn't market it enough. You know, I was trying to be objective and, if you like, unusually modest in that English kind of way, and just identifying the evidence that I could put together, rather than getting half a dozen people say, oh, this was wonderful, it transformed my life. I didn't know about David at that point. So there is that diffuseness which has then that lack of definition, and that's part of the problem I have, and I assume many people in social sciences have, of tracing, of auditing that thing, particularly when you can't do it through teaching and the people you've influenced by presenting your research findings through teaching, which to me is simply knowledge exchange.
Ian, you'll never make it in the entrepreneurial university.
I used to teach courses on the entrepreneurial university, bro.
John.
John Brennan. I just want to reflect in the last, fairly recently, I've been involved in 2 BIS-funded projects on the wider benefits of higher education. And, I mean, echoing, in fact, what William has just been saying, and I think David, mentioned as well, I mean, I think an important question of benefits to whom? And the point about it's not just individualizing, but to the larger society. But in addition, I would want to add to the point of how impact slides into benefits, and I would actually make a plea that when we talk, or when your centre talks about impact, you come up with the notion of positive and negative impacts, and look again at who is receiving what. Another project which I've just finished on effectively the regional impact of universities. And in fact, if you want to, go off and do some research and interview some of the people who live around your local university, the impact of the local university on a lot of the neighbours, is very interesting and really can have quite a lot of negatives, as well. So I would just, extend the concept of impact away from benefit and have a larger view.
I suppose you can also talk about too much impact too. We've got one more here, and I think that'll be the second last. Is there anyone else who wants to go on the speaking list? No? Maybe that's the last then. Yeah, okay. And we'll go to Paul.
Carl Allen, short question. As we move between knowledge and understanding to insights effectively shared, was that a change or is that a completion process of a perhaps circular process as we constantly move between the both?
Sorry, can you elaborate, please?
Okay, we shifted in the definition from knowledge and understanding to insights effectively shared. Is that a change or is that the completion of a process? Because what's the use of knowledge and understanding if at some point we can't look at the impact and share the insights? Is it a change or is it a completion?
Elise, I'm happy if you take that on, but I think the question really is about whether impact is essentially part of a continuum with the research itself, or whether we're talking about 2 distinct processes which may or may not be joined together in a kind of Foucauldian, notion of heterogeneous sites, which are pushed together for one reason or another. Is that right? Continuum. Yeah, continuum versus assemblage, if you like. Fragmented assemblage, yeah. Yeah.
Can I pick up a few points from the questions that were being asked? Is that all right?
By all means.
Marketing the case studies, Ian, I think has just gone out. It's interesting to see that in many universities the case studies were written by academics themselves, and there was a lot of struggle around becoming brave enough to use particular kind of language in order to phrase and to describe the impact. But I think there was a sense, and from speaking to panel members, there was a sense of kind of authenticity in some of those accounts, and the ability to see through those hesitations that there may have been there. And the strength of those accounts was that they were very much rooted in whatever evidence people could gather and to provide, and they were quite hedged as well in terms of the claims being made. So you find case studies where a claim is being made and there are 3 sources to corroborate it, and then it's very academic in the style in which it is written. And I think that's fine. And that's part of the strength of some of the case studies. And then there are other case studies which were very courageous in different ways, in the sense that they didn't shy away from making an argument about discursive impacts, about changes in language, changes in ways in which problems are framed in public spaces. And some of those, as far as I could gather, some of those case studies were very successful in the exercise by the criteria of the exercise itself. So maybe there is space for more courageous takes or interpretations of what would count as a case study and what would count as a rich enough narrative of impact. On impact on teaching and learning, this is something that's been picked up over and over again in professional fields, but also in the arts and the humanities, where I was saying earlier, it's very hard to draw a line between this is the scholarship and this is the teaching and the research scholarship, and this is the scholarship of teaching and learning in this particular field, and we have to assess them and to think about them in different ways. So there is this continuum there, and I don't think we've quite cracked it in how we think about impact at the present moment. Positive and negative, I agree. The whole thing takes a different shape though when it comes to performance funding, performance-based funding of research, and when the stakes are quite high, because things become reinterpreted as part of that particular mechanism. Change or completion of a process, I think I've argued that in each discipline, even prior to the definition of the ref kind of becoming so much part of what we talk about in terms of research, people are talking about anchors for discourses of impact in their own practices, in their own disciplines, and there is an authenticity about those discourses and things that we do anyway, which are part of how we think about research anyway. So there is a lot of that already happening, with or without sanctioning it through performance-oriented assessments.
Karen, I don't want to eat intervals.
Yeah, I think so. I think we're now really at the point where we bring Paul into the conversation. And I mean, I think David and Elise have laid out a complex policy and interpretive terrain. And we all know how important that this terrain is for us in a practical way, and it also presents us in higher education studies with really interesting conceptual challenge and new opportunities for empirical inquiry. So we're hoping that Paul, as the closing of our 3 principal speakers, will take us one step further forward in grappling with this terrain in policy sense and in a research sense. Paul, as many of you will know, is a Professor of Higher Education at Lancaster. He's on our CGHE Management Committee and leads two of our projects, or co-leads 2 of our projects, with Jenny Case at the University of Cape Town. He's been an immense contributor already to the development of CGHE, and he will lead some of our seminar-related activity, particularly the seminars we will develop for early career researchers in higher education studies and for other social science researchers who have not been previously active in higher education studies field, but we hope to draw into working on higher education problems.
Thank you, Simon. As Simon said, one of the things I'm responsible for in the centre is capacity building. And as part of the programme we've got within trying to develop capacity both of new researchers, but also building the capacity of higher education research more generally, is a series of seminars that we're thinking about in the moment in terms of views from the outside. And in a way, I would position what I'm going to talk about today as a view from the outside. I'm not someone who does research into research impact. Where my research is located is in relation to curriculum, learning and teaching and assessment in higher education. So what I'm going to do is to focus on, whereas David started by saying, okay, what does teaching impact look like from the standpoint of research impact? I'm going to take the alternative view and say, okay, given the research on learning, teaching and assessment in higher education, what does that tell us about research impact, teaching impact? What can we learn from that over 30 years body of research on learning and teaching to help us think about impact. In doing so, I think one of the things that tends to happen in impact debates, and fortunately I think certainly in David's talk he did what I'm about to claim that most people do, so that was a bit of a relief for me, is that we tend to focus very much on what counts as impact. What is the nature of the impact that occurs? Whereas I'm much more interested in the question of what has impact? What are these things that we're claiming have impact in the ways that we want to claim? So if we think generally about, if you wanted to know which are the most impactful universities in the world, where might you start? I want to argue that the place most people probably start is in international rankings of universities. They give us a sense of some kinds of impact in relation to research. Some of them give us ideas about relations with industry, regional impact. Some of them tend to be not very good, but some of them have measures of teaching impact. And what they do is they focus on bringing together input and output measures. Now, it's important to be clear of one thing, is that they're not designed to measure impact. So, for that reason, they don't give us a sense of the mechanisms by which impact occurs. But just as an aside, I thought it would be interesting to think, okay, there aren't just developing measures of teaching and research impact. We actually have these things called international rankings and national rankings that actually, in people's minds, probably in many ways serve as a strong proxy for the impact of institutions. So if we sort of, or if I rather, try and think about a way of conceptualizing how that looks within institutional rankings, you sort of have inputs that shift to outputs that shift to impact. Okay, and as I say, there's no sense of the mechanism of impact because that's not what institutional rankings are trying to do. Then, if we move to measures of research impact, and I think Alice gave a wonderful rendition of impact within the research excellence framework. The way in which that looks at impact, the way in which it needs to be underpinned by institutional research. And that's one way of measuring the impact of research. At a project level, the UK Research Councils ask us to think about the demonstrable contribution that excellent research makes to society and the economy. That's their sense of impact. But this isn't just a UK focus. So within EU, the European Union Horizon 2020 projects, there's a strong feeling that it needs to contribute to public debate, the tackling of societal challenges, and it needs to be made usable to policymakers and the public. And they've produced a whole list of impact measures that you can look at. So the number of patents from projects and various other things. So this isn't just a UK obsession, this is something that's focused on internationally. Now, what's crucial for me here in terms of if we ask the question about what has impact, the focus here is very much on individual projects, or as was shown in some of Alice's extracts from case studies, individual people and how they have impact. So if we focus on that kind of diagram, we have projects or people, we have some kind of translation device, and then that leads to impact. So the idea that if you're going to have impact, it's not just the knowledge has to be translated in some way. And one of the things you end up with this kind of move is mantras such as dissemination is not the same as impact. And for me, that characterizes something that's going on in this way of thinking about impact. If we move to think about measures of teaching impact that are at a much earlier stage of development, what do we have? Well, probably the main measure, and certainly my interpretation of the recent English Green Paper would be that it's the government's favourite measure of impact, seems to be graduate salaries. Okay, I went to university, I did a course, I earned this much. But we also have other measures. So we have the OECD's Assessment of Higher Education Learning Outcomes project that David Sweeney referred to earlier. what it's trying to do is to compare the quality of what students learn in a number of different countries. That's a project that has continued despite lots of rumours of its death. I've talked to various people from around the world over the past 2 days, and I've had people telling me absolutely definitely that it's definitely gone, and I've had people telling me equally certainly that it's rising again. I don't know, I don't have the connections to know what's going on with the OECD. But it's a sense of, okay, we need to look at what students gain. Similarly, HEFCE have funded a number of learning gain projects. And I think one of the crucial things for me here, and again it was reflected in what David Sweeney was saying, is that the move that tends to happen with measures of teaching impact is a focus on generic skills. So David, to be fair, said to us, well, we need to start with disciplines. We need to see what there's difference between disciplines, but he also talked a great deal about transferable skills. And my sense of my expectation is that where these things will go is they'll say, okay, we'll start with disciplines, oh wait, hold on, let's do generic skills because they take away the complexity of disciplines. So if we think about my diagrams here, we have a sense of teaching that leads to student learning, that leads to impact. So if we ask the question here of what has impact, there's teaching and there's some kind of sense of student engagement. And within this way of thinking about the impact of teaching, you end up with similar kinds of mantras to dissemination is not impact. The long-established mantra in this context is teaching does not equal learning. You have exactly the same way of talking, that the act of trying to convey something does not equal the person you're conveying it to understanding it. But if we go back to the question that David Sweeney raised of what difference does higher education make, that for me raises a question around, well, what is it that makes a difference in higher education? What is it that students engage with that leads to changes in their senses of who they are and what the world is? And my argument would be, well, that's knowledge. And in all of these ways of thinking about impact, knowledge, for me, becomes completely invisible. There's no sense of what these knowledges are. And so, is there a way of conceptualizing the impact of teaching, the impact of research that puts knowledge at the center? So, to do this, I would go back to Basil Bernstein's work and the notion of the pedagogic device. So Bernstein's argument at the level of society was that knowledge gets transformed as it moves through different areas. So we have knowledge as research, the production of new knowledge. We have knowledge as curriculum, the idea that what happens when a curriculum is formed is that people get together and they say, well, what's the essential knowledge in here? What gets included? There's arguments, there's contestation. People say, oh no, your pet subject, irrelevant. I want to teach this. And governments and professional organisations say, you must have this as part of your curriculum. Now, the essential thing that Bernstein argues is that this means that the logic of curriculum is not the same as the logic of the discipline. What happens is that knowledge as curriculum is a completely transformed version of knowledge, the knowledge as research. And similarly, when students then engage with that curriculum, they then transform it themselves. They relate it to their sense of identity. They relate it to their previous understanding. So the understandings that students developed are a transformed, changed version of knowledge as curriculum. And so there's a real emphasis here on how knowledge is transformed as it moves between these different forms, and also, crucially, that there are power struggles going on. This is a rough, awkward, difficult, political process. It's not a rustic harmony in which everyone gets together and brings things together and go, oh yeah, here's a curriculum, you know. It's about struggle. It's about power. It's Who has the right to define what the curriculum is? So, for me, there's a question of, well, how does that way of thinking about the way in which knowledge is transformed help us think about impact? So, if we start with knowledge, the argument, as I've said, is that you then have these transformational interactions that move it into curriculum. And then you have transformational interactions that lead to some form of student understanding. And at each stage, the logic of what is formed is different from the previous logic. So how might that work in relation to research? So you have a sense of knowledge again to start. But then you have a transformational interaction as it moves into the translation device. There's not a sense that what's being translated is exactly the same as the research finding from a project. And then as that moves to have impact, it's changed again. So this sense of the difficulty of attribution, for me, isn't just about distance. It's actually that as things move between being knowledge to being something that's moved into a usable form to something that's used, the logic of the thing actually changes. So if we go back to teaching impact and go back to the diagram, as you can tell, I'm really very, very proud of these diagrams. So, if you don't like them, don't tell me, okay? You can tell me anything else, but don't tell me you don't like these pictures. So if we go back to this sense of teaching impact and actually ask a different question this time, and we say, who owns the impact here? Okay, so in this case, who owns the impact is the people who did the teaching and the student. They own the impact. But if we develop another version of impact based on what I outlined in relation to the pedagogic device, it starts to look different. So where we start is with the collective body of knowledge. Okay, and then that's transformed into curriculum. And then that's transformed again in relation to teaching and learning interactions, which is transformed into student understanding, which is then transformed into impact. So if we now ask the question, who owns the impact? Oh, is that owned by the collective body of knowledge and all the people who contributed to that? Is that owned by the curriculum and who designed it? Where's it owned? So immediately, questions of who owns impact become much more difficult and much harder to engage with. Also, there's a shift here in terms of a focus on collective practices. It's not about individual teachers teaching, it's about teachers as a community, as a group of people teaching together, drawing collectively and argumentatively and awkwardly on a shared body of knowledge through which to form curricula for their students, which then they engage with their students and transform together into something else. So it becomes a much more collective process than is suggested by teaching student learning impact. And if we do the same with research, we have project or person, as I said, translation device and impact. Who owns the impact? Oh, the project, the person. And for me, I was delighted, partly because they were so interested, but partly because they served my purpose so well, with the extracts that Alice used, where you could see those claims for impact were about how this person or how this project led and owned certain kinds of impact. Whereas if we kind of put this through Bernstein's pedagogic device, what does research impact look like? And then again, we start with a collective body of knowledge that gets transformed into a project. But then, when the project reports, it goes back to the collective body of knowledge. This is one of the, Alice mentioned category errors. This, for me, is the supreme category error of our current approaches to impact, is that when you produce your outcomes, you take them back into relationship to the body of knowledge in order to understand them. This idea that any single project should inform what we do, when any study could be an outlier, to me just seems sort of just perverse. But what happens is the project goes back into the body of knowledge, and then it gets translated and transformed within interactions. And within the literature on research impact, there's a really interesting body of literature about productive interactions and how impact happens mainly as people get together and discuss and bring things together. And then that leads to impact. So again, we have a sense of, okay, now who owns this impact? Is it owned by the discipline? Is it owned by the project or the person? Is it actually owned by the people who engage in transforming and translating it? The sense that a project can say, hey, look what I've done. Isn't it rather good how many people I've saved? The idea that any individual project can do that in isolation from these other processes, for me, is actually something that makes no sense with my understanding of how knowledge practices work, about what it means to make an original contribution to knowledge. An original contribution to knowledge is a dialogue with the other people who've done research in your field. Developing a curriculum is a dialogue with the body of knowledge as we know it within a particular area. So the idea that as individuals we should be claiming ownership of what happens, and as John rightly pointed out, whether that's ownership's positive or negative. In both ways, it's both the negative aspects of impact and both the positive nature of impact are collective products. And not just collective in terms of research teams, but collective in terms of societies. So, to answer the so what question, as I've argued, current approaches to impact obscure, for me, the crucial roles played by collective bodies of knowledge. But also, it's not just about the research. The second point is the collective transformation of those bodies of knowledge into usable material. And that's not done just by researchers. In many cases, it's probably not done by researchers at all. So the idea that this is a researcher-led process, to me, is something that I find clearly challenging. Then, finally, that actually there's issues of contestation and power in terms of what's recognised as impact and who owns it. So the sense of whose impact case studies within the REF were counted as good evidence, actually power and prestige play a crucial part in this. If you're a leading elite institution and you want to ask a policymaker to write you a nice little reference about how your project changed their way of seeing, I would argue that might be slightly easier to do than if you're someone at a far less prestigious institution. Does it mean that the impact was different? I'm not really sure. To me, it's an open question. And so what I think this gives us, these ways of thinking about impact, is it gives us individualised and ahistorical accounts of impact. And the name of the game is to claim ownership. One of the things that I'll never do, but you sort of think, oh, bit bored, what can I do? One of the things I'd be interested to do is to work out, for all the impacts claimed in the REF, how different would the world look to how it looks today? If every single one of those impacts were achieved by all of those impact case studies separately, I bet you the world would look a completely different place to how it looks today. And that's the nature of the game. And clearly, there's huge issues here around accountability and what research does. Clearly, this isn't simple, and I would completely agree with David Sweeney that we have to engage with these issues and think about how the efficiency, the contribution of research is measured. But the idea that we should play along with this individualised notion of what impact is. To me, the arguments I'm making suggest that actually it makes sense to think about impact at the level of a whole system. What impact does the higher education system have in particular societies? That, to me, seems to be an answerable question. And certainly when I read the SRC documents about impact, when they write the overarching documents about impact and they talk about the impact of social science generally on society, that, to me, reads as a much more convincing account of what the social sciences do than individual projects casting around for some metrics, some evidence of what they need. And I guess for me, what's crucial here is that if, as higher education researchers, we're going to engage seriously with these tasks, then we need to do more than accept the categories we're given. We need to do more than respond to the challenge to give an individual case study. We need to mount arguments and challenges for the way of conceptualising, but then we also need to develop alternatives. And we need to develop alternative ways of thinking about how we measure the impact of both teaching and research. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Paul, for that very thoughtful address. The question you raised about the impact of higher education on society is an interesting problem, isn't it? I think if we could make progress on that, we could probably declare CGHE a success. The group of us have been working on a project which we call High Petition Systems Project on a cross-country basis for about 2.5 years. And one of our unanswered questions is when the world moves from systems of higher education which enrol 15% of the population typically to systems of higher education that enrol 50%, and already 52 countries are enrolling more than 50% of the age group in tertiary education, that's 2-year programs or above. When you move to that kind of world, and I think it's fairly obvious that on the current trend that about half of all young people will enter tertiary education within 25 years. When you move to a world like that, where half the population potentially is going to carry qualifications into the labour market of a post-school kind, and half the population has access to that advanced scientific literacy and advanced general literacy, what does that mean? I mean, what kind of society is that? What kind of society have we created or contributed to by doing that? I mean, in other words, what is a high participation society? What kind of world is emerging as a result partly of higher education? I don't think we know the answer to that question, but at the rate of change, it's going to be a very different looking world in another generation. At this point, I think we'll move to a more extended period of conversation with you. And I'm going to ask William to take the chair at this point. Our panellists for the session effectively are William and Elise and Paul, and I hope they'll take the opportunity during the discussion to intervene, to respond, and also to sum up perhaps at the end. We'll close round about 4:25.
Okay, just a couple of comments before we get going with questions, comments and discussion. I was feeling a little bit unsure of the word impact before I came today, and after hearing the three speakers, I'm confirmed in that set of doubts about the word impact. Simon, you mentioned that in our original thinking about the centre, we had two kind of organising concepts. One was clearly about globalisation and the place of higher education in that, which has remained in the title. The other word was about engagement, or the concept was about engagement, how we would be an engaged centre and how we would investigate the engagement of higher education in society. It was actually going to be called the Centre for Engaged Global Higher Education, but we thought that was a bit of a mouthful, so we decided to shorten it. But I think that's important because engagement suggests a dialogue or an exchange or a communication, even maybe collaboration, rather than a one-way impact, the kind of point that Peter Scott was making earlier on. It's not linear, it's about a dialogue. And that's why we talk now about knowledge exchange rather than knowledge transfer. That's why we talk about learning and maybe even students' experiences of learning rather than teaching. So feel free to take forward the critique of the word impact, but maybe also to think about other kinds of words or metaphors that we might use that captures what we've been talking about this afternoon. So any thoughts, questions, comments? Before we ask John again, anybody else? Far away, John. Sorry, was there another? It's difficult to see. There's a light shining right in my eye.
Technology.
No, it's okay. We're now mic'd.
Very much enjoyed Paul's analysis. I would just like to throw in a couple more concepts which I think are broadly relevant, here. And these really are of differentiated higher education systems in increasingly diverse societies. And that the processes, that Paul was taking us through, I think a further, level of complexity is that you will have diverse impacts in differentiated higher education systems and differentiated society. And coming back to Simon's, comment of the growth of the system, one of the things which I often remind people who refer to the Martin Troe elite mass to universal systems in terms of system growth is that Martin always emphasized, but a lot of people forgotten, that in the mass and the universal, you still had the elite within that and the mass within the universal. So effectively, in the higher education system, which we are just coming into now, you would have, in a sense, universal, mass, and elite processes sitting side by side.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I think, that level of complexity is always incredibly important in thinking through natures of impact and how impacts look in different situations. The other thing is that the target is always moving. So the sense of what we tend to do when we're talking in shorthand is that we think cross-sectionally. We take different cross-sections of what's going on and end up comparing actually different students or different elements of research rather than thinking longitudinally and thinking about how trajectories work through. And I think if you're going to have a serious discussion about the impact of teaching or the impact of research, that sense of having a clear trajectory and talking about the same ideas, the same people, the same form of technology, whatever it will be, you need to have that linkage of a trajectory through, rather than what we largely have now, which are snapshots, and then because we have to, we predict the future on the basis of them, even though actually what we're talking about is a completely transformed situation. And I think dealing with that level of complexity isn't a reason to say, well, we shouldn't do it. In a way, it makes it even more important to engage with it, but to accept that any engagement we have simplifies. And to think about, okay, it is a simplification, I need to recognise that and respect it, and I also need to think about what work my way of simplifying does. What is it that is an artefact of that way of simplifying, and what is it that actually seems to be going on? And I think the only way to do that is to have different takes on the same issue and to move between them and to say, okay, how does it look from this perspective? How does it look for that? And I think, that's slightly the danger of where we might go with a TEF, is a single gameable measure of teaching that becomes the one definition of teaching quality, rather than, as you've pointed to, John, a notion of differentiated teaching qualities, and not teaching qualities in a hierarchical sense, or that's enough for them down the road, but a sense of actually there are different forms of teaching, there's different engagement with students, and actually that difference is important because what's crucial about teaching is Lee Shulman's notion of pedagogical content knowledge, the idea that you're bringing particular students in relation to a particular body of knowledge. And that relationship is always going to change in different settings. And it's not about elitism, it's not about hierarchy, it's about the essence of good teaching is recognizing what the thing is you want students to understand and who your students are, and bringing them into relation to each other.
I think one interesting thing for me is that this differentiation works in different ways, in multiple ways. And when you think about research, be it a project, be it a system, be it being collective knowledge that's accumulated over a period of time, and then impact, I'm always wary of any sense of kind of passing of parcels between those things, however transformed, however changed. And my emphasis on the relational side of impact is precisely to say, well, actually, in those collective processes, there's more than just one sector involved. There's more than, it's not only a higher education kind of owned process, which then becomes translated into something else that moves into another sector. But it's all of those diagrams that I showed with all of those spidery things are a way of trying to capture the way in which this actually plays out in a range of contexts, be they projects, be they more collective kind of endeavors. But those complex, diverse relationships go beyond just the higher education sector, and I think that's really important to remember that that's at the heart of impact.
I think Simon had a...
Yeah, I had a point too. John, interestingly, you bring in Martin Trow, and I mean, Trow's idea, as people will probably know, was that systems transform in their character. Individual institutions are affected by this as enrolments expand from. He said from elite to 15%, which he said was the beginning of a mass system, and then a universal system at 50%. He said universal because at that point of time, people have to enrol their children in higher education if those children are going to have sufficient opportunities in life. It becomes effectively compulsory for the middle class and then for everyone. I mean, universal at 50 is a bit confusing, and I tend to think that that word was a problem, and universal at something higher would be more useful. But I think the point is that higher education changes its character as it grows, and as John said, one of the things that happens is that the elite institutions continue, and elite faculties within institutions continue in the mass and universal phase. One of the things that seems to be happening in this phase, which is where participation gets to 50% and beyond in many countries, is that the elite institutions are becoming stronger. When Trow was concerned, when institutions were in the mass phase, that the great elite public universities like Berkeley, where he was working, were going to be under greater and greater pressure, and they'd be massified, they'd be dumbed down, they'd lose their strong links between teaching and research, and the quality of professional programs will be emptied out. In fact, what's happened, as it's quite evident around the world, is that the world-class university or top 500 or top 100 university, and particularly the top 20 or 30 university, is stronger than ever in terms of its social role, its economic necessity to countries and so on. So I think we've all assumed that that's a function of neoliberal competition, that's stratified systems and that's strengthened the top institutions, and research rankings appear to play into that notion. I would argue that that's true, but also there is a dynamic that occurs when systems grow, when they grow to a certain point where the elite education becomes, the relative scarcity of it increases, its value, its positional value increases in absolute terms, and the competition to enter it becomes greater. At that point, it elevates further. It naturally stratifies in a vertical direction further, even without the help of government regulatory frameworks or quasi markets. So you have a natural process, unless you correct it, like in the Nordic systems, by equalising everyone more again, you have a natural process of stratification. Now, the point of that preamble, is that long preamble, is to say that if you have these highly stratified systems, and increasingly we're aware of stratification, we always have been aware of it, but we're increasingly aware of it now, then the notion of a single impact or a single excellence starts to lose its meaning in reality. If you think about it, the missions are different. Teaching missions are very different between large mass teaching institutions that have got an access mission and elite providers who are operating with highly selected intellectual cohorts, leaving aside the question of whether they're socially selected. So if you've got differential missions in both teaching and research, and certainly in teaching it's obvious, then the notion of a single impact framework might be problematic. And what tends to happen is that if you impose a single impact framework, it becomes another way of differentiating the system vertically. It becomes another thing that confirms the hierarchical structure and strengthens it in ways which are, I think, create a closure. So better, I think, to move in the direction of contextualisation, to talk about impacts and excellence and quality in terms of different missions. Not only different missions in terms of vertical stratification, but different missions in terms of horizontal diversity as well, like the difference between the German Fachhochschulen and, with their vocational technical manufacturing sector mission and the high academic universities. So I think we need to start to break down these regulatory concepts, to start to nuance them, and to start to differentiate them, or they become instruments for reworking the sector in ways which we don't like.
Okay, let's move on. I think Heather had a question.
Heather Eggins. It's very important, this particular topic, not only that it's an area that we need to do more research on, but also it was very clear from David's presentation that HEFCE is looking for ways in which they can measure the impact of teaching, and that is very likely to lead to money being given out to the different institutions. Therefore, I think as groups of researchers working in this area, it becomes perhaps even more vital than usual. There are two aspects that have not been touched on by anybody, and I don't know whether any research has been done, but these are the dimensions of time and space. We talk about the impact on students, but that impact may not fully show for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, very, very longitudinal, and yet that can be very, very important. Has anybody attempted to do anything on the effects of time? And the second thing is looking at the numbers of our students now in our universities who are international, who will come here and study and aren't now allowed even to work here, so they have to go back to their original countries. Yet the impact on them, because they are now a marked percentage of our total output, is also very, very important. But HEFCE feeds monies into only the UK system. We are in a global system now, and everything is interconnected.
Thank you very much, Heather. I think we should just clarify that it's a green paper from BIS that is really proposing a TEF, and I do appreciate HEFCE's, having worked there for a time, I do appreciate HEFCE's position in this situation. It's highly political, and that's why David didn't say as much as he might have wanted to, I suspect. So we do have to recognise these kinds of struggles that are going on, and even within the government between different ministers who want to have legislation about higher education and those who don't, and so on. But anyway, any comments about time and space in terms of, I think you were talking about teaching in particular?
Again, I would agree that they're crucial. I think the other thing I would think about in the consultation that's gone round about the teaching excellence framework is the focus for metrics seem to be very much on students' experience in their final year. And actually, as well as their experience 20 years later, as you pointed out, there's also the first year experience. And we know from considerable research that the first year experience is absolutely crucial in shaping the success and the experiences of students. So why wouldn't you have as an element of a metric far more focus on the quality of the first year experience rather than solely focusing on what happens in the third year and then immediately 6 months after graduation? So I would agree, this sense of doing research that takes different frames in terms of time and space and thinks about how quality looks differently if you look at it another way is absolutely essential in developing alternatives. The danger we run into is that we wait for the prospective TEF to be developed and then we immediately respond to that technical consultation rather than actually trying to imagine how things could be different and using that as a starting point for developing completely different alternatives. And clearly, those alternatives aren't going to be implemented in the way we want, but just to be part of that public debate. The translation of TEF from green paper to technical consultation to implementation, that's another process in which power, contestation, change happens. And one way of impacting on that is to think seriously about how it could be other and then using that to inform, senses of what it is, rather than most of the critique I see in relation to government proposals, which is, let me show you how this is completely neoliberal. Let me show you how this just takes us to a point, which is clearly important, but unless we can suggest ways it could be other, ways and the benefits of it being other, then for me, we're not doing our job as higher education researchers.
Very quickly, I think there is a risk in relation to any kind of discussion of impact to fall again into a very impoverished language. Some of the things that I was talking about earlier point to learning as personal growth, to acting deliberatively and ethically in a social space, to building multiple layers of meaning, making sense, constructing communities. I mean, all of those things belong to a rich language about learning as well as about knowledge, about research. And it's quite easy to kind of slip away from that language in the attempt to identify something which can be turned into a measure.
Yeah, I just comment on how we seem to have an assumption around being able to anticipate learning outcomes. There were a lot of what David was saying reminded me of debates in the 90s around learning outcomes, graduateness and so on. We seem to have taken the surprise and the creativity and the unknown out of education and learning, and assume that we can kind of somehow predict what's going to happen and then measure it. Did you want to say that? No? So, Vasiliki.
There's three, actually. There's Diana as well.
Diana.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your discussion this afternoon. I just wanted to have your thoughts on whether the academy, the research, higher education research community or research centre should have a sense of responsibility in relation to potential impact. So what I'm trying to understand is in the past we know that there were systems of regulation of sort of the scientific knowledge that could matter, whether we were contested, but there were spaces to discuss the contestation. Now we also hear understood that impact could be potentially negative, so it is not necessarily only positive, and sometimes we know that research is not, the piece of research hasn't reached the maturity that is needed for going out. And we also know that the academy has its rewards and some systems of competition. So the impact now becomes a state of mobility. And so I wondered whether you think there is a space for regulating internally the potential impact, or whether we should leave the market of influence to do the job. So our responsibility and potential impact of our work. Thank you. And I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Dr. from the investorship here.
Thanks, Vasiliki. Comments?
Should I go?
Yeah.
I think I feel quite strongly that as academics it's part of our responsibility to reflect on the values that surround our work. And I don't think we can shrink from that. It's part of behaving with integrity and being an ethical academic. So in that sense, there is responsibility. I don't know whether it's about formal regulation or it's other forms of self-regulation, but there is responsibility in reflecting on this and in articulating the ways in which you can actually act on the basis of these value commitments. When this becomes something that is to be performed for public reward, then often it gets off track. And I think some of the things that I showed today are examples of how that can happen.
Paul?
I would agree. I don't think I've got anything to add.
I think there was a clear message from David that we have to take a responsibility unless we do that in terms of informing whatever is going to happen in the TEF or even in the REF now that the review is open. If we don't take that responsibility, things will be done to us that we won't necessarily agree with. I think that was a fairly clear message that David gave.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very important. And I mean, in some ways, this last exchange has kind of captured the politics of the situation quite well. I think Elisa's point about academic integrity, you know, is really the starting point for anything we do. I find that when I look at different approaches to academic freedom in different countries, that the Chinese civilizational notion of the kind of positive role of academics, of professors as exemplars of good values, not only in relation to their disciplines and their professional disciplines, but also in relation to behaviour more generally. That they also have a positive contribution and a role in relation to social order and good government, and if necessary, at the extreme, if the government needs the message to stand against government, and they have a responsibility to advance schemes which contribute to general prosperity. That kind of positive notion sounds conservative, but actually it's not. You know, it could take a critical form. And I think that obliges us to approach this, you know, in ways which develop our teaching, learning and research mission rather than subverting or reducing it. At the same time, I think the point that David makes is completely right, that HEFCE, BIS, the regulators who understand the sector have the job of reconciling the pressures for a simple, reductionist, economically driven approach to these things with the reality that the sector is a much more complex and much richer place than that. And they have to find a way through. Now, this is one of the ways in which we hope to contribute at the centre, but we know that this is a bigger task than what we can solve. But if we can find a way to harness and reconcile those academic values and that responsibility to advance rather than subvert our work, with HEFCE and BIS's need to find a way of innovating in this area which makes that advance, which establishes benchmarks, concepts and measures and non-measures as appropriate, which make that advance. If we can contribute to that process, we are doing very well. And I think that we have an obligation to find a way through that thicket and not to simply fall back on the classic, Anglo-American academic response of complaining about the government and being powerless and taking no responsibility. I think we have to take responsibility. It is our work that we're talking about, and it's our responsibility to find a constructive rather than negative way through government.
Thanks, yeah. Diana.
Thank you. Paul, I did like your diagrams, especially when you unpacked them. But you have a very important statement. It's actually up on the slide now, that our game is to claim ownership of impact. And I absolutely accept what everybody's been saying about we have a responsibility to engage with this. Absolutely agree with that. We have full ownership of your sequence of diagrams. If you were to unpack the right-hand side of your sequence, there's quite a gap between what we do with graduates and their potential impact. We're producing graduates who end up with jobs in call centres. Now, they may be a lot better at those jobs than they would otherwise have been, but that's not the kind of impact we're aiming for. And we don't have full ownership of that end of that process, do we? If we were to unpack that, where does our responsibility lie? How do we deal with that end of the translation into impact?
Yeah, thanks, Diana. To clarify, my sense was, or my argument was, the current way of dealing with impact. Within that current way of dealing with impact, the game is to claim ownership of impact. What I was trying to convey is exactly the point that you made, is that actually that sense of who owns impact doesn't make sense as a question, because these are collective practices within particular contexts, within particular moments in society, and even things that people, that seem to be on the face of it unproblematic measures of impact. So I mentioned with Horizon 2020 the number of patents. Well, actually, when I'm involved in discussions with scientists at Lancaster and talk goes on to patents, their position is patents are worthless unless you have the money to legally back up a patent is not worth the paper it's written on. Because that's the only thing that matters with patents, is do you have the lawyers to defend your claim to ownership? So, you know, this way in which we black box notions of research, we black box notions of impact, is, you know, there's the kind of argument I'm mounting isn't that policymakers should talk in these rich, nuanced ways. Their task, their job is completely different from our job. But we need to think about these things in rich, nuanced ways in order to frame an alternative for them that then gets translated into the form that they can engage with. And I think, you know, certainly that notion of, you know, when we're flattered into claiming that we own the impact of a particular project and it was our work that saved however many lives were saved, you know, there's something, to go back to Alice's point, it lacks integrity. You know, really, we know that's not the case, but we've got so caught up in the game of claiming impact that the fact that we're making a claim that we don't really believe in is something that we don't perceive as problematic. And, you know, we as academics, we're so privileged. You know, we have the privilege of engaging with knowledge and creating knowledge. And if as part of that privilege, we don't, in relation to those things, say, actually, I know that's not the impact, then I think we need to question whether we're using the privilege we have in the way that has the greatest benefit to society.
I think I agree with you, Paul, on possibly most points. Although I don't want to foreclose the possibility of individual or project impact completely. Partly because there are examples, if you look back in history, that kind of work as exceptions to the rule that you've just set out, and they're quite obvious. So I don't think it's a kind of blanket statement that although I do understand the words of caution behind what you're saying.
I would fully agree, and I think the point for me is that yes, exceptionally, that's what happens. But what we have at the moment is a system based on exceptions rather than based on actually the way in which impact operates in most cases.
I'd say we also shouldn't expect to control the impact or influence of how can we, but we can continue to have a dialogue once the research has been published with the potential users or beneficiaries or even those who might be negatively impacted by it. And nobody's really mentioned the role of the public intellectual, if you like, which, if I can use that term, but there is a responsibility to continue to be actively involved in that dialogue after the research has been published and for some time afterwards. Simon, did you have a comment? No? Jenny, I wasn't sure whether you had your hand up. Yes, Jenny first. Yeah.
Yes, Jenny Case from the University of Cape Town, and thank you very much. This discussion, especially as it's evolving now, has really been very useful. And I suppose to follow on Paul's thing of being an outsider, I really feel like an outsider. I come from a country where this impact stuff hasn't hit us yet. It must get to us in 10 years' time in a possibly worse form than you're living with. We seem to take policy in that way. And I think the combination of Alice's, if I'm pronouncing your name, so documenting how this game is currently working, and then Paul's push to imagine something different, I think is a really good space for working in the centre. And I suppose, Paul, I mainly wanted to just comment a bit, because I actually think that your proposal around centering knowledge in this space is really powerful, and I hadn't thought of it quite in this way. And I think it comes back to what higher education can do and is about. And there were comments yesterday about, you know, we're so quick to want to claim that we can solve all of society's problems and functions and things, and it comes to Diana's comment here, and that's really a kind of simplistic view on society as well. And to come back to we do, and I think your idea of focusing on knowledge transformation is very powerful, and for me it reminds me of Boyer's argument about different scholarly roles. And of course it's very recent times that we got obsessed with the discovery mode in a way, and an assumption that all academics are going to do that at an extremely high level. Whereas if we have a view, and I think your argument about a system or even an institution would be better than trying to look at all of this happening in one one individual, if we were able to document, and I think the real challenge is how we can document these things. Everybody wants metrics and they want 4 stars and so on. But I think the potential role of some of the research that we will be doing, maybe here in the world, I'm thinking of some projects in the centre, but also more generally in higher education, where actually we try to document these transformational processes and seeing how academics are doing that. And of course, you've centrally shown, the pedagogic device and the work with students. There, the thing of documenting how students have been transformed by knowledge is something that we really are looking to try and do in a more nuanced way than a simple satisfaction. Well, I don't even think satisfaction surveys are in anything around how a person is transformed by knowledge. So I just wanted to really thank you, because I think this has really sharpened for me some of the thinking about what we're currently doing, and I think there's good work to do. Thank you.
If you're transformed by knowledge, you may no longer be satisfied.
Exactly.
Any comments?
No, that's really helpful, Jane. I think when you were talking, I was thinking how quick in the UK universities were to sign up to the employability agenda. Now, I'm not arguing that universities aren't about employability. There's been professional subjects in universities since they were founded. But the ways in which universities and institutions see money and then say, yeah, we can do that, and then we end up in a situation in which we've contributed to going to university being about how much you earn at the end of it. We have responsibility in that. Because for me, the point of university is to engage with the collective body of knowledge and be transformed by it, to see the world differently and to change the world. That's what, for me, is about higher education. And clearly, that can contribute to employability as a byproduct of those processes, but it's not central to what we're doing. And the more we play games where we say, okay, we accept that's central because we've got to do it because we want the money, the more we have to bear those costs, and we need to accept that we have some responsibility within that.
A kind of sideways comment to this question. I'm kind of listening and thinking that it's been a number of years since we've been grappling with external kind of demands for research impact, and now we're grappling with another kind of discussion. We've been arguing for years and years that it's important for academics to reframe the problem and to articulate things better. Why aren't we doing it? And why haven't we succeeded in any way in kind of shifting those grounds? And it is partly a rhetorical question, but it's also a question that I think points to the dimension of time, because this is not something that you can do once and for all. It's something that you have to do flexibly, and it's an ongoing conversation into which you need to feed lots of thought and to articulate things very clearly.
Great. One last question from the gentleman over here.
Carl Allen. I ran an adult literacy and numeracy class in 1970. At the very first session, it turned out that it was mostly young women attended. When we asked them what they wanted out of it, they intuitively knew. It's not what they wanted out of it, it's what they wanted to give their children out of it. They wanted their children to be able to enter primary school at a literacy level similar to the middle class. And it's the same problem that Diana referred to. These low-income graduates that work in call centers per se, that's where the impact will show. If their children will be able to enter university at a level which is comparable to the middle class. Now, our next problem. Yes, global or we might say universal higher education. I also mentor students, and one of the things I do with their mathematics homework is that I select questions and tell them, give me 3 approaches to that question or this question. Solve the problem in 3 different ways. And all I see is that universal higher education is turning out students, mostly, who can only think once, because that's how they have been taught. They haven't been taught to think twice on a problem. So more is not better. in this case, unless the input is somehow changed?
Yeah, I mean, what was raised powerfully for me by your example is the question of how we're very quick to set boundaries around higher education and separate it from other forms of education. And actually, that's something I'm writing a chapter at the moment with Monica McLean, and we were having a discussion around the thing I said a few moments ago about the higher nature of higher education, about coming into transformational relations to knowledge. And in the dialogue Monica and I are having on this chapter, she said, well, I'm not having that in there, because actually I think that's what all education should do. Why is it just higher education that should do that? And I know Claire Callender, also from the centre, has done some really interesting work on Sure Start centres and the ways in which putting on higher education courses for parents, particularly mothers, in Sure Start centres can transform the ways in which they think about their parenting. So actually, education is transformative. So rather than, oh, you're poor, you need parenting classes, actually engage with education and change the way you think about yourself. And so that question of, do I actually, in being very clear about what I think is about higher education, set up other boundaries that might not be useful to think about other questions. And I think that's what all commitments we have do. They all illuminate some questions and close others off. And I think, the example of what people gain from adult literacy or what they gain from a Sure Start centre, it's about education. And really, it's education that's at the centre rather than necessarily the particular expression of education that's crucial.
Nothing much rather than, aside from saying that it's probably, the question for me is what is education about higher education more than what is higher.
That's a nice way to conclude. I think we come to a natural conclusion.
Thank you again to Elise and Paul for those thoughtful and original presentations, which really do help us considerably, and all of us, in our thinking about impact. Thanks to William also for his work today, but also for his work in developing our engagement with stakeholders, from the very beginning of our process. And can I say thank you to Carolyn and to Anna again for this wonderful launch. We're still conducting researcher meetings and project planning, but although most of that has now been completed, and we've got our advisory board meeting tomorrow, but this is the final public event in the launch process. Now, yesterday, when I closed at Senate House, I invited everyone to become involved in our research-related activity, not only our seminars and conferences, but through developing ideas and initiatives and future projects for us to support and engage in. CGHE is a research centre with not just one or two, but many research leaders. We already have 11 partner universities, and it will support you if you want to lead a research initiative which adds significantly to the knowledge and impact of the impact of that knowledge. And we promise that when you present at one of our conferences, we will make sure your slides are loaded on the on screen. Today I want to close by inviting you to become involved in our impact-related activity. Ideas move best, when history tells us this, I think, ideas move best when they can diffuse and hybridise within a cosmopolitan environment that's multimodal in character, multinodal, and that's the kind of environment we want to facilitate in the discussion of higher education and its future. Within our current family of 15 projects, there are varied implications for impact. All successful research projects have impacts that play out, as Paul said, as part of a larger body of knowledge, a larger set of inquiry than just the project itself. Those impacts are not only collective, but they're diffuse, they're indirect in many respects, and they're long-term. Now, all projects have that, and we hope that all our projects will do very well in that regard, but we also know that it will be very hard to demonstrate that clearly. Now, about half of our projects, or a bit more, also lend themselves to a linear model of impact. that's specific to their findings. That is, that their findings come out and then they're directly and immediately in some way relevant and useful. And we may be able to demonstrate that. Those are the kinds of projects which will especially engage our stakeholders in the process. That's why some of our projects will attract more than one stakeholder in terms of the research process and its dissemination. Others will perhaps be less exciting for our stakeholders. But we want all those projects to work. We want to pursue all of them vigorously. Both sets of projects are important. And we need the longer term, synthetic, larger picture, sometimes deeper inquiry, sometimes more highly abstract and theorised inquiry alongside the applications, the relevance, the policy formation and change. So we want you to join us in the dissemination events and in interrogating the relevance, application and use of our ideas, both in terms of the policy and practice space and in terms of knowledge. We want you to work with us in developing the utility of our findings in the work of your own organisation and institution. We want you to give us feedback about how our work might be developed to be more useful and relevant to you, and developed in relation to the larger body of work of which it's a part. We look forward to sending you a newsletter and you engaging on our website. You've seen our web address, www.researchcg.org. We look forward to seeing you at our open seminars and our next public events, and hearing your voices and talking with you and splicing your ideas together with our own. Thank you for coming today.